And I'm going to start this time around with the 98-99 Broncos. Now this squad has multiple Hall of Famers: John Elway, Gary Zimmerman, Terrell Davis, recently inducted Steve Atwater, of course, Shannon Sharp, Uncle Shannon. And then you had Pro Bowl receivers like Ed McCaffrey and Rod Smith. I mean, honestly speaking, this is probably one of the more underrated offenses in NFL history. You're talking about one of the best backs in the league at the time, a good offensive line, a legendary quarterback, and 2 Pro Bowl receivers. I'm surprised this team doesn't get more talk. Then you had that defense, which was no slouch at all. I mean, you had Steve Atwater, Hall of Famer at safety, and on the defensive line, you had Neil Smith, who was a 90s All-Decade player. I don't know, in my opinion, I feel like if you make the All-Decade team, you should be a lock for the Hall of Fame. So who knows, he might be getting added in to the Hall shortly. I feel like you would have to give Elway, Davis, and Sharp an X factor at the very minimum. Also, I do want to give a shout out to Mike Shanahan. He doesn't get a lot of respect these days, but he did go back-to-back with these Bronco teams who couldn't win the big one. In my opinion, he should be Hall of Fame. Next up, we have the 97 Packers led by prime Brett Favre. And this was a bit of an obvious choice here. When you talk in the late 90s NFL, the Packers are in that conversation. And to be honest, you look at this roster, you only have 3 Hall of Famers: Reggie White, Leroy Butler, and of course Favre. But as far as the rest of the team goes, these guys really aren't household names. I mean, I will give a shout out to Dorsey Levens and Antonio Freeman, who did have some solid years, but you can never consistently say they were elite. Honestly, my main reason for choosing this team is Brett Favre. I feel like in modern conversations, he doesn't get the respect that he deserves because, if you just look at his stats, it's not a pretty story. But Brett Favre was that man. And the fact that he was able to get a ring with I would say, average cast speaks volumes about his legacy overall in the history of the game. Now for this one, I did have to put my bias aside. I, like many others out there, am a Cowboy hater. However, you can't deny the elite talent that was on these 90s Cowboys teams. We're talking about Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin, Deion Sanders, and of course that offensive line. There's just so much talent in the Hall of Famers. Like, you gotta put them into the game. No question about it. I do think they pose an interesting question of what if as well. We all know about how Jerry Boy did Jimmy Johnson dirty. What would happen if, let's say, Jimmy and Jerry could have got along and Jimmy Johnson could have stayed the coach of this team until the 2000s? Do you think they would have racked up another ring, potentially? We know Barry Switzer was able to come in and sleepwalk his way to a ring, but do you think the Cowboys still have the same downfall with Jimmy at the helm? That would be a very intriguing scenario to see it play out on a Madden franchise if they were included as a classic team. And now we got the 98 49ers. And my God, this team is just loaded right here. Probably the best receiving duo in NFL history. T.O. and Rice, 2 top 5 receivers of all time. Depending, I know a lot of people hate on T.O. You have a recent Hall of Fame inductee in Brian Young. And then at quarterback, you have Steve Young, who, in my opinion, has an argument for the greatest mobile quarterback of all time. It's actually kind of sad with this team. His career got cut short because of those concussions. And then I think that's when Garcia took over. Some other standouts on the roster included Garrison Hurst and Merton Hanks. It's wild to me that this team couldn't make it back to the Super Bowl, seeing how much talent they had on this roster. Honestly, when you compare it to the other 49er teams who did later on go to the Super Bowl, you would think that this roster would have been the one to get there, considering they had the best quarterback and receiving cores of both of those squads. Just try to think about how this team would have matched up against the 2019 Chiefs. We know their defense wasn't necessarily their strong suit, and the fact that Jimmy G played so bad in that Super Bowl kept them in the game to come back. But do you think they're going to be able to stop T.O. and Jerry Rice with Steve Young throwing to them? I don't think so. It definitely would be a fun challenge trying to get this core another Super Bowl ring because, our boy T.O., he never got one. And Steve Young's legacy would have definitely gotten a boost from that. In my opinion, he's one of the more underrated quarterbacks of all time, given just like his mobile scrambling ability. That run against Minnesota in like I think '87 was one of my favorite Steve Young highlights. Now, of course, this team barely needs any introduction. Talking about the '98 Vikings, Randy Moss, Chris Carter. Once again, top 5 receiving duo of all time. I mean, you could put them in a conversation for greatest with Rice and T.O. I mean, I honestly, there's no wrong answer there. Actually, now that you think about it, with Jake Reed, they probably have a more well-rounded receiving core. But also, you have Randall Cunningham launching bombs, and then Robert Smith, as Chris Berman called, the spin doctor. I would definitely have to argue that this is the best team within the last 30 years, and possibly all time, to not even make the Super Bowl. And you can't explain it any other way. It's just Viking luck. That's just what the Vikings do, man. I'm sorry to say it, my Minnesota fans out there, but they just blow it. I swear we were robbed of an all-time great Super Bowl matchup with the Vikings and Broncos. Like, just imagine how high scoring that game would have been. You'd had Elway and Cunningham going back and forth, Moss and Carter going off. I would have to say, like, yeah, that's the one. We should have gotten that. We deserved that Super Bowl as football fans. But you know, Gary Anderson had other plans, unfortunately. I gotta say, putting this team in the modern NFL would be crazy. Just think about it for a moment. This team broke the scoring record in '98, and we're going to sit here and put them in the modern NFL where the defenses are so neutered. That would be wild today. Let me not get too excited though, because you know modern, man, they would have a 78 overall cornerback, Moss, and Randy Moss himself on the jump ball. Y'all gonna have to tell me if they finally fixed that on Madden 23, because I tell you, it is ridiculous how easy it is for corners and safeties to outcatch wide receivers, for God's sake. Now this right here is one of my personal favorite all-time teams, the '99 Jaguars, who, when it comes in the conversation of greatest teams to never make the Super Bowl, they are often overlooked. The crazy thing about this squad is that they lost 3 games all year, all to the Titans. Titans swept them in the regular season and then beat them in the AFC title game to go to the Super Bowl. So for my Jag fans out there, I can understand why you probably have a strong hatred of the Titans that's over 20 years running. But if you look at the roster makeup of this team again, great quarterback Brunell, Fred Taylor, many who think should be in the Hall of Fame, and a good receiving duo with Jimmy Smith and Keenan McCardell. Obviously, it's fair to say this is probably the best Jaguars team of all time. And you gotta put some respect on that Jaguar name for coming in the league in '95 but getting to be contenders so quickly. There was no way I was going to make this list without including the Lions with Barry Sanders. Like, we're talking about who many consider to be the GOAT at the running back position, and just in general one of the greatest NFL players of all time. But contrary to popular belief, he did have some decent pieces around him. Obviously not on level with what Emmett or other greats had, but Herman Moore was a great receiver for his time. And on that offensive line, he had Lomas Brown, who made several All-Pro teams. So again, it wasn't like a complete talent wasteland. It was just what they had at quarterback. They weren't going to be winning those Super Bowls. Honestly, it still bewilders me how the Lions refused to trade him and Calvin Johnson and get something back, but at least they finally did with Stafford. I will say that these Lions are probably the weakest of all the teams that I picked. I did have a bit of a debate between them and the '97 Patriots, who had Curtis, my favorite, Martin, Drew Bledsoe, Ty Law, but I think at the end of the day, Barry gave the edge to the Lions. But you know, I'm very interested to see how some of you guys would have done this list. Who would you have taken out or putting in? Let me know down in the comment section, and make sure to subscribe because I definitely have some more content dropping soon.